Hello and welcome to this Marks and Clark podcast on the subject of COVID-19, how to manage your intellectual property rights. For those of you who are not already familiar with Marks and Clark, we're an international group of intellectual property service providers, which includes patent attorneys, trademark attorneys and lawyers. Now, today I'm joined by Philip Cupitt, Esther Gottschalk and Simon Portman. Philip is a patent attorney specialising in high-tech and engineering. Esther is a trademark attorney who's an expert in all aspects of brand management, and Simon is a solicitor specialising in commercial contract work and regulatory matters for technology companies. My name is Sheila Wallace. I'm a patent attorney specialising in chemistry, especially pharmaceuticals. We're going to talk about things that you need to think about when managing your intellectual property rights during these difficult times. So, Esther, what have you been hearing from your clients? And what do you think are their main concerns at the moment?
So initially, I think everyone was really worried about the logistics, people being put on furlough, whole marketing teams weren't around, and everyone was trying to get their IT working. So unless companies were used to having loads of people work from home, it was really tricky. And that certainly occupied the first couple of weeks, I think.
How about you, Philip? Do you have similar concerns?
Yes, my experience has been very similar to Esther's. Also, what I've noticed has been a big difference in how different sectors have dealt with the crisis. So, for example, the high-tech sectors have, it's still more or less business as usual for them. But in the engineering and manufacturing sectors, perhaps they have been more affected by the lockdown than other sectors.
That's interesting. I think I would agree with the sector difference. In life sciences, it's much more business as usual because product development takes place generally over a much longer timescale than in the engineering industries. And the strategies for controlling the COVID-19 pandemic rely on innovation in the life sciences field, such as searching for effective drug treatments, diagnostic kits, and so on, development of vaccines. So in many ways, the current crisis is also an opportunity for companies in the life sciences field. How about you, Simon? You must be getting some inquiries on the contract side.
For a start, as you know, I head up our virtual reality team, and the virtual reality companies are very much coming into their own in the current crisis. The fact that everybody is having to work remotely and communicate without being physically near each other means that there's increased interest in VR meeting facilities, where one can meet in a virtual environment using an avatar, and not just communicate, but also do things like training and product design to quite a high level. Also, we're finding a lot of our healthcare clients are suddenly in the front line, as it were, helping to develop, test and distribute test kits, and develop vaccines and manufacture and distribute PPEs. So although there are a lot of challenges in the current crisis, I say there are also a lot of opportunities.
Yes, I have to say I really agree with that last point. Obviously, at the moment, if you're managing an IP portfolio, there are some basics that you need to really think about if you want to manage your IP assets effectively. Esther, what are you sort of looking at from the trademark perspective?
I think it's particularly difficult right now for companies who are without their usual staff contingent or who are struggling with cash flow. So, and 40% of British business is closed. So what we're sort of looking at is basically crisis managing IP over the next 6 months. So you see what's coming up, you defer what you can, but you make sure you don't lose any of your rights. So it's still important to do things like renewals, but a lot of deadlines can be postponed, they can be extended. The registries are getting used to this. So clients who need to get loads of evidence on for an opposition, for example, we would probably tell them to extend so they're not trying to get documents from offices that are closed, and so that they can defer all non-essential costs. Because what we're seeing across industry is it's very few companies for whom it's completely business as usual. This is unprecedented in terms of a crisis.
It certainly is an entirely new way of working for many of us. You mentioned documents. Simon, execution of documents must be a tricky one at this time.
Yeah, obviously you can't just scribble a signature in ink and exchange bits of paper. So clients are obviously having to rely on electronic signatures, things like DocuSign, or signing using a pen on an iPad, just signing a PDF and then scanning it in and emailing it. I think the trouble arises where there are stricter formalities, for instance, where notarization is required. I don't think the EPO likes electronic signatures very much still. Where you have a document that requires witnessing, English case law suggests that you can witness something by being physically near the person signing, so you could look in through the window and still observe the 6-foot personal distance rule. However, watching someone do it over Skype, strictly speaking, won't cut the mustard. Now, I think what we're all hoping is that a realistic view will be taken on documents executed during this period. What I would advise, though, is that anyone who's unsure whether they've got all the formalities completely locked away when they're signing something now should sign a confirmatory document when the crisis is over. I'd also suggest that, where possible, documents be executed as contracts, not as deeds, and that way you can dispense with witnesses, because having a witness sign is just another person you have to get hold of to sign on the dotted line. So the simpler the better, I think, in the current climate.
That's very sensible advice. Philip, I mean, in patents, it's a very deadline-driven area. What sort of things are you having to cope with and your clients?
Well, I would say that the patent offices around the world have dealt with the crisis very well. They've been very proactive. So most, if not all, of the big patent offices have, for example, made available quite generous extensions. For example, at the UK Intellectual Property Office, all extensions or all deadlines are being held in abeyance until such time as the crisis ends. And that is very helpful for applicants, both as they struggle to manage their own cash flow, but also as they have a bit of a vacuum as their IP managers are out of action or concerned with other things. I think something, though, that companies do need to be aware of is that not all deadlines can be extended, and that different patent offices are granting extensions in different ways. So you can't simply put your head in the sand with your IP portfolio and expect everything to be okay. You do still need to keep on top of the deadlines and be aware that not every deadline can be extended. And I think on that note, one thing that we've experienced with smaller companies is that the people responsible for their IP portfolios and patent portfolios in particular have been furloughed, or in other words, put on leave for the period of the crisis. Now, that can lead to a vacuum in management of the IP portfolio. There's no one who knows the background to the patent rights and no one who is in a position to make a decision. So my recommendation would be that companies ensure that either they don't furlough the person who's responsible for their IP, or at the very least ensure that someone who is still going to be working is fully briefed and given authority to take any necessary action to avoid a loss of rights.
That happens a lot with trademarks at the moment, because if we're not being instructed by in-house counsel, we're being instructed by marketing, and marketing seems to be a group of people who are really getting furloughed a lot. So companies have had to make sure they've got someone in place who can pick up a portfolio. And sometimes, these portfolios are very complicated, and it's the person who's picked it up as well is probably still doing their day job too, which makes it even tougher on them.
I think it's tricky as well when you've got new people taking up a job in an area that they're perhaps not so familiar with. As we're seeing the same thing in the life sciences area. People are being furloughed and others are having to take on additional responsibilities. It does make it more difficult to get instructions. A further problem for life scientists is that if you are trying to get a tricky case granted, you quite often need comparative data to support patentability. It's a problem to get that kind of data at the best of times, but just now it's particularly difficult. Really, scientists can't even access their laboratories to perform new tests, and even if they've already got the data, it's hard for them sometimes to access that data in their systems. So I think we're finding that you need to be quite creative in formulating strategies to keep cases alive at the present. But with that in mind, what sort of tactics do you think we could be using at the moment so that we don't destroy the long-term value of IP? I mean, Philip, you started to talk earlier about particular problems in the patent area.
Well, certainly there are lots of opportunities to extend deadlines at the moment, but that's only going to get you so far. That's only going to push some costs down the road and not avoid those costs entirely, which for many companies, particularly if they have suffered a massive drop-off in revenue during the crisis, that's not going to be enough. So I would suggest that those companies take this opportunity to start managing their patent portfolios rather more proactively. So in other words, going through the big overgrown patent portfolios that have been allowed to develop almost by default during the good times and start looking at rationalizing those. So, for example, deciding how the IP or patent portfolio maps onto their competitors' products and onto their own products, and looking for any patents that really are no longer supporting the business. And those patents and patent applications, they are really candidates for rationalizing. For those applications and patents, they could allow them to just die off naturally through non-payment of renewal fees, or alternatively, the company could take this opportunity to try to monetize them, whether that's through selling them to someone to whom they might be more valuable, or licensing them, or even possibly litigating them. So there are lots of ways in which companies can use this as an opportunity to organize their patent portfolios in ways where perhaps they wouldn't have needed to have done so had life remained as normal.
Okay, I think that's very interesting to hear your comments about how you can look at the whole portfolio. That's possibly, it's probable that you can do that in the life sciences area as well, but a single patent can have such a huge value. You have to be very careful that you keep your important ones going, and they may be protected in easily 30 to 50 countries across the world. So sometimes pruning patent protection on a very important patent in the life sciences field can be a short-term thing that may not be helpful in the long run. But it's certainly worth thinking about at this time. There's always deadwood somewhere that can be cut. Of course, this is not the first time that we've experienced a global crisis. And many of us will remember the 2008 financial crisis. Looking back on that crisis now, what IP strategies do you think were successful, and which of those do you think might work now? Philip, do you want to kick that one off?
Yes. So I've read an interesting report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, and that was written in about 2012 in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And they analysed how various countries had responded in terms of their R&D. And what's interesting to note is that a lot of Western countries really cut back on their R&D spend, whereas some Asian companies, particularly China and South Korea, carried on investing through the crisis. They carried on with R&D and carried on with patent filings. And so now I think we have seen some of that in how the Western economies have fared relative to these Asian economies. We now see that Asian economies are becoming dominant in consumer electronics and telecoms. We also have seen the particularly Korean companies making quite big inroads into the automotive industry. So really my take-home guidance from how to learn from the financial crisis is that companies should try to weather the storm and keep investing in R&D the crisis presumably will end at some point, and those companies who have continued to invest in R&D, they stand a chance to steal a march on their competitors when life returns to normal.
That's so important. I recall from the life sciences side, last time in the credit crunch, many companies cut their R&D immediately and then found that they had no new products a few years later in the pipeline. So effectively, their businesses were hit for a second time when they should have been growing stronger. So it's very important to keep a pipeline of new products for the future health of the company. I mentioned earlier that a single patent, though, can have a huge value. And I think it is an opportunity to be imaginative about what you can do to keep cases alive. I mean, we've already mentioned getting extensions, and that would include things like further processing at the EPO to delay taking action. But if you can't put off taking action any longer, there are ways of doing the minimum where perhaps you file a response which does no more than satisfy formal requirements, but doesn't necessarily move the case forward. At least that will keep the case alive until you're in a better position to take action. Simon, imagine that at this time, investment in R&D must be something that has to be looked after from a commercial point of view as well, in terms of contracts to protect it and so on.
Yeah, and I think people realise this, and I think ultimately, although this is much more serious than the credit crunch, there is a feeling that we're all in it together. There's a lot more cooperation taking place. There are more financial safety nets. And I think, the solution to this problem is going to be technological in terms of tracing infection, antiviral treatment, testing, and vaccines. So I think people realise the real need to actually invest in R&D, not just in general, but to get us out of this hole. I think also I've noticed that, granted, companies are inconvenienced by the fact that people are furloughed and that they might have budgets squeezed, but at the same time I've noticed that companies are now suddenly, in some ways, more productive than they were before. The ones where they have contracts that they still want to get on with, they're driving them through much more quickly. I think part of it might be not necessarily a sense of urgency, but with everyone working from home, you can actually get more done during the day because you've got no travel time. So oddly, in some ways, this has galvanised some businesses.
That's very interesting. I mean, Esther, in your field, obviously, brands are everything. Trading is affected. What have you found?
Well, what I keep hearing people saying is that there's nothing in the past that's having the effect or the impact that this crisis is having. I think, in the last financial crisis, we learnt lessons around prioritisation, around cost management and timing. But the reality is no one wants to launch a brand under these circumstances. I think, though, one of the sort of surprising benefits has been that a lot of companies have increased their brand goodwill by diversifying. So, making clothing companies making gowns and masks for hospitals, people sharing restaurant sharing pizza recipes that they previously kept very secretly guarded. That does a lot in terms of their own brand goodwill.
It's not all doom and gloom for companies, though, at the moment. As we've seen, there's quite a lot of opportunities for companies who are switching to make ventilators. There's the race to find new drug treatments, new diagnostic kits and vaccine. Obviously, in some cases, that's going to mean you're going to have to make use of others' IP. So how do you do that in a time like this? What are the challenges of switching to new product lines from a contractual, legal and technical perspective? I mean, Simon, the contractual side must be a bit of a nightmare, surely.
Yeah, I think there are challenges for both the licensor and the licensee. If you're the licensor, you might be licensing out your intellectual property to new users. And what you're going to be careful about is that you get a commensurate royalty. And even if in the light of this crisis, you instead wish to give your intellectual property out for a lower than usual royalty, What you've got to be careful of the fact is that when the crisis is over, you might then find that you've given that IP away and suddenly you should be charging a commercial arm's length amount for it and you're no longer able to. Or that you've licensed your IP, say, for a whole load of ventilators at a low price to meet the emergency, and then when the emergency is over, no one needs that IP anymore. So I think careful consideration has to be taken when you're negotiating these contracts. Also, companies have to be wary of the fact that there are regimes like compulsory licensing and Crown right use, which mean that people can use your IP at a lower rate than normal under governmental rules. The other thing is, if you are a licensee, it's all very well saying, I'm going to get into making hand sanitizers if I'm a distillery, or I'm going to start making ventilators or PPEs. But there are several challenges there, even if you have the right to use the IP. Firstly, do you have the expertise to make those things? You might make them and then find that they do not meet the relevant regulatory standards, and then what could have been a PR success has actually damaged you. You've also got to put in place new manufacturing and distribution networks, hire the right marketing people as well. So it's not just a case of saying, I'm going to make this today to meet the emergency.
So if you've switched to a new product line and you make a new invention in the course of that, how can you protect that if you're sort of working within the terms of perhaps a license to switch to the product in the first place?
Well, I think in the first case, what you should be doing if you're negotiating a license like that is agreeing who will own the IP if any new IP is generated. A priori, the IP is owned by the generator, but you obviously may not want to leave it that way. So any agreement should say who will own that IP. It may be at the very least that if the licensee owns it, the licensor will want access to it. So these are things that can be sorted out, but you need to sort them out in the contract. And of course, at the moment, people are getting things in place very quickly. So there is a danger that details like this will get lost in the panic. You've got to take a step back and think about what needs to be in the agreement, just as you would do under normal circumstances.
That's very sensible. Philip, what about from your side, from the protecting invention side?
Well, I think that companies should, as Simon said, they should, when collaborating in circumstances like this, they should decide who is going to own any IP that's generated over the course of the collaboration. But also, going back to my point about companies trying to rationalize their patent portfolios, I would say that companies should also take a decision really on, after the crisis is over, does it make any sense for us to incur the expenses of filing patents for this invention? If this is just going to be a short-term aspect of the business and not part of your long-term strategy, then I would suggest that there's no point in filing a patent application for it. So you have to take a decision as to whether the costs of patent filing are really justified by the benefits to your business.
That's interesting. I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of new things coming in from clients who may have diagnostic kits and so on. So there's clearly a lot of invention going on out there. Esther, if you're starting as, let's say you're a brewery company and you've switched to hand sanitizers, what do you do on a trademark side? I mean, are you potentially damaging your trademark by operating in an area where perhaps your mark isn't registered? Is it something you should do there?
It depends really whether you're going to be selling the hand sanitizer under the brand or whether it's being white labeled. You know, I suppose there are sort of infringement questions if your particular brand is diversifying into a different area where somebody else might have registered rights. So that could be a problem. I think you'd probably follow, if you wanted to market the brand for those new goods, then you would probably follow the normal process that you do when you're clearing a brand. You'd search and see if there are any issues that would come up, and then you'd have to make a commercial decision on, you know, the risks that you may or may not incur. So I know there've been some, cosmetics companies who've been switched from perfume to doing hand sanitizers. They're closer in terms of similarity of goods, so it's less likely to be a problem as opposed to, say, a brewery switching to those goods, which is very, those are very, very separate. So I think you'd still have to perform some legal checks to be sure of any risk that you were undertaking. Most brand companies, they diversify a lot all the time, so they're used to going into a different area and then seeing whether that brand would work in that space.
Obviously, a very complicated area with so much to think about. So let's sum up what we've been talking about. What should companies be thinking about now, and what action should they be taking? What's your sort of take-home message, Esther?
So I think the important thing from a trademark perspective is you need to review what's coming up in the next few months and then triage it according to cost, to complexity and priority. And just bear in mind that some things that used to be straightforward, like the collection of evidence or legalizations of documents, is bound to be more challenging, particularly when it comes to issues around time.
And Philip?
I think that companies should continue to invest in research and development during the crisis, try to weather the storm and try to come out of this crisis in a better position than they went in. I also think that companies should try to use this opportunity to rationalize their portfolio and to find a way to get rid of or monetize any patent rights that they had built up during the good times, which are no longer really applicable to their business.
I think from the life sciences side, although it's tempting to take drastic action in the short term, I think it is important to take a long-term view. Don't abandon your key patents just to make short-term cost savings. Remember that patents are valuable and they can add to the value of your company in the long term. And Simon, what's your key advice?
Yeah, I think I would echo all of that. As we've all been stressing, we are going to get through this. There is a lot of talk at the moment about how do you get out of your contracts? Can you terminate them for frustration or breach or force majeure? What I'm saying is, when this is all over, you're going to want those contractual partners again. So if possible, see if you can negotiate changes in those contracts to accommodate the current situation, and then get back into things when it's all over. Because I think when this is over, companies are going to remember how their contractual partners treated them.
Very sensible advice all round. Thank you very much for joining this Marks & Clark podcast with Esther Gottschalk, Philip Cupitt, Simon Portman, and me, Sheila Wallace. If you want to know anything else, we are updating our website and LinkedIn pages regularly with content that can help you in the current environment. Thank you again for joining us.